today we're going to be talking about Cynefin. This is sort of a two-parter this evening, or at the end of today, you've got two bearded guys with long hair talking about complexity theory. But the big focus today is going to be Cynefin. So maybe give me a show of hands. Who here has heard of Cynefin? They've just heard the phrase. Okay, a lot of hands going on. Not everyone, but a lot of hands. Who here would say that they use Cynefin regularly? It's something that they think about or use almost daily. Okay, now there's a couple of hands there. Okay. That's useful context and feedback for me. Now, for those of you who don't use or aren't aware of Cynefin, the previous few sentences might have been a bit confusing, but Cynefin is something I use pretty much every day. It's a very core part of almost everything I do. So that's why I put this talk together, to sort of tell you what it is. And what Cynefin is a leader's framework for decision-making. I mean, technically, it's just a framework for decision-making, but this was a Harvard Business Review article, so you've got to have a catchy title there. And it was invented by this guy, Dave Snowden. So if I reference Dave in the context of Cynefin, it's this Dave, just for reference. And a lot of the work in this, and a lot of what we'll be talking about in this talk, is building on some of Dave's work. And what Cynefin says, in kind of a nutshell, in a single sentence, is that when we find ourselves in the world, we find ourselves working with different types of systems. And we need different approaches to decision-making depending on the kind of system we're working in. That's it. That's Cynefin in one sentence. So some of the systems we find ourselves working with are pretty clear and simple. They're understandable, they're predictable, they're deterministic. We would call these clear systems. The example I always like here is, imagine you're sorting packages in a post office. Okay? A package comes in. It's a local delivery, okay? You pick it up, you put it in the local delivery pile. Another package comes in. It's an international delivery. You pick it up, you put it in the international delivery pile. Then one comes in, and it's got a big red urgent priority shipping label. You pick that up and you put that in the priority shipping pile. What we do here in clear systems, our approach to decision-making is what's known as sense, categorize, respond. We look at the world, we look at the type of package in front of us, we figure out what rule applies, and then we apply that rule. Sense, categorize, respond. And the reason we do that is because the constraints we're working with here are pretty fixed. If I have an urgent package, there's no reason for it to go in any other pile than the urgent priority pile. There's no real flexibility here. So we know the solution here. We would say that this is the realm of best practice. There is one solution that works, and you should just follow that solution. This is also the realm of standards. We know the answer, so just go and follow those rules. This is where automation works really well, right? There's probably not someone sorting all of your packages by hand in your local post office. It probably is at least partially automated. We would say that this world is filled with known knowns. We know what is going to happen. Now, some other types of systems are still ordered and predictable and deterministic, but they're a little bit more complicated. The example I like here is a car. If your car breaks down, you probably aren't going to open up a big book and follow a flowchart to figure out exactly what went wrong. Now, if you narrow it down, if you scope your problem down to a particularly small part, yes, you might be able to do that. But if you're looking at that car as a whole, that big, complicated car, you're going to take a slightly different approach. What you're going to do there, at least what I would do, because I don't own a car, I can't drive, and I have no idea how cars work, is I'm going to call an expert to come and help. Someone with expertise and experience in these types of systems. And what they're going to do is they are going to take an approach known as sense, analyze respond. They're going to look at that car, they're going to listen to the noises it makes, look at the symptoms of these problems. They're going to analyze what could be wrong and what might be the solution there. And then they're going to apply a response to that. The constraints here aren't quite so fixed. We've got a different type of constraint here. We have what's known as a governing constraint. Governing constraints define the outer bounds of what is possible, of what's allowed. If I want my car to work, it should have 4 wheels and an engine. If it doesn't have 4 wheels and an engine, that car is not going anywhere. That's my governing constraint. But within that governing constraint, I have a lot of flexibility. Different engineers might choose different wheels. Different engineers might tune your engine in a different way. You have flexibility within these governing constraints. So it's not the case here that we have one best practice, one correct answer. What we have here are good practices. There are some generally accepted good practices for fixing cars. There isn't just one perfect solution. So we would say that this type of system here is more difficult, it's more complicated, it's still ordered and predictable though. This is a gradient here between clear and complicated systems. But it is ultimately still knowable. And then we get to the third type of system, and those of you who were at Tron's talk a few minutes ago will know, of course, that the third type of system is a complex system. And we sometimes use these words interchangeably, right? Oh, it's very complicated, it's very complex. But they're very different types of systems. This here is a phase change. The distinction I like from Dave is that complicated is a Ferrari and complex is a rainforest. A Ferrari is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts in there, but you can take it apart and you can put it back together again and it's still a Ferrari. And you can still have a degree of confidence that it's going to work like it did before. You can't do that with a rainforest. It is more than the sum of its parts. How do you even define a rainforest? Where is the boundary of a rainforest? I mean, obviously it includes the trees, it's called the forest, the ground maybe, where they are embedded, and we might want to include the rain, because that's also in the name, but then maybe we should probably also include the animals that live there. The other plants, maybe the climate system, the weather, even the lunar cycles. It's very difficult to draw the boundary of a complex system. Again, Trond talked about these as open systems. No clear boundaries here. And these are dynamic, ever-changing systems. They're evolving around us. As soon as we interact with them, they change, which means they have a very interesting property. They're non-reproducible. If I take a tree out of a rainforest, something's going to happen. I can set up cameras, I can watch the impact it has on all of the animals, all of the subsystems of this rainforest, and I can learn loads and loads of things. But if I do the same thing 1 week later, I might get a different set of outputs. I might get a different set of responses. They're non-reproducible. So a plan that worked yesterday might not work today. Who here knows about the reproducibility crisis? Yeah. So the reproducibility crisis is a crisis in a few fields of science, which refers to the fact that a lot of research, a lot of really core, important, foundational research has been found to be non-reproducible. So these research papers documented the process, and when people try and run through that experiment again, they get different results, which means, oh, hang on, the research that our entire field was built on, maybe we can't trust it. And this is a huge crisis. But the really interesting thing, and I'm going to try not to be too flippant here, because all of the complexity researchers looking at this have kind of pointed out, hang on, the fields where this keeps happening are fields like economics, fields like the social sciences, psychology, biology, fields that deal with complex systems, fields that deal with non-reproducible systems. So all of the complexity researchers have kind of been looking at the reproducibility crisis and been going, yeah, Of course they wouldn't be reproducible. That's kind of their whole thing. So we have these dynamic, ever-changing systems, open systems. We need a different approach to working with these. What we do here is we do what's known as probe, sense, respond. We have to do something in the system. We have to change it to see what happens. And then we respond to that change. Claire talked about this morning. You can analyze and estimate as much as you want, but at some point you're just going to have to start building and see where you get to. We're taking here an experimental approach. Our planning has limits, so we have to experiment our way forward. The constraints we have here are what are known as enabling constraints. So they're not governing constraints, and they bound the system and limit what's possible inside. The example I like here is from Paul Cilliers. Inside your ear, you've got a little membrane. It's known as your eardrum. Now that bounds your ear. It is the barrier between your inner and your outer ear. But it also makes up the ear. Without that eardrum, you don't hear anything. It both bounds, constrains, and forms the system. It literally enables you to hear. It provides structure that allows the system to work. The system and the constraints act on each other and evolve alongside each other. The types of practice we're looking at here are exaptive practice, where we radically repurpose things. Maybe you remember at the start of the COVID pandemic, people were being intubated. We didn't have enough respirators to keep people breathing. So what did people do? We repurposed diving pumps. We repurposed anything that looked like a pump. We radically repurposed it to a new context. That's what we do in complex systems. We experiment and adapt. We take ideas and we adapt them to new contexts. We would say that this is the realm of unknown unknowns. We fundamentally do not know what we don't know. We are only going to figure things out by going forward. And then, moving on from complex systems, down here we have chaotic systems. This is another frustrating one, right? Because we use this phrase chaotic all the time. If you have kids, I'm sure you've looked at their room at some point and said, that's very chaotic. But the term chaotic here really refers to a lack of any meaningful, any effective constraint. So if I were to throw you into a raging river, you're flailing around in the water, you have nothing effectively constraining you. That's a chaotic system. Your actions are essentially random. You can move your arms wherever you want. You're not going to make structured progress forward. So what you do here is you grab anything that gives you structure. You act, sense, respond. Build that structure, because while you're flailing and drowning, that's not a very good place to learn and grow. You need a bit of structure to do that. You grab onto anything. You grab onto a rock. You grab onto a bit of wood. You grab onto someone's leg. This is the realm of novel behavior. We would say that because the system is moving so fast, yes, technically you could model every single molecule of water around you and predict exactly the perfect way to move your arms and legs to go up towards the surface, but by the time you've done that, the system has changed. We would say that chaotic systems are functionally unknowable. We've also got these two in the center here. AC, this refers to aporetic and confused. Confused refers to a state where we don't really know which of these systems we're in. That can be dangerous because we're generally going to apply whatever we're comfortable with. And aporetic refers to states where we induce contradiction in our minds. We induce unanswerable questions to help us explore new states. So that's the sort of standard introduction to Cynefin, the sort of foundation here. But what I want to spend a little bit of time doing now is digging a bit deeper. Really looking at some of the ideas built around this. And one of the first things I want to kind of emphasize here is that Cynefin is a framework, not a model. This on the screen here is a model. Okay? It's a model of a house, maybe a real house that exists or a house that someone planned to build. And a model describes reality, either a reality that is or a reality that is intended to be. And we use that model to make decisions about reality. I might build an engineering model like this one to decide, hey, if I build this house, is it going to look nice? Or how big would this door need to be? Or how strong does this floor need to be? Now, at this point, I am legally required to quote George Box and say that all models are wrong, but some are useful. But models try to describe reality, and that is not what Cynefin is. Cynefin is not trying to describe reality. We don't judge Cynefin based on how closely it maps to reality, because Cynefin is a framework. A framework gives us structure to build around. This is a framework of a building. This does not describe a building. It gives us things to build on. We still need to put things here. We still need walls and floors and ceilings and all those lovely things. If you build a site with React or Kitten, it doesn't describe the site. It gives you a framework around which to build. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at, is some of the ideas and the concepts and the techniques built around Cynefin. And one of those is this very important point that these are not clear boundaries, right? I'm sure you've all seen, I know for a fact you've seen, because I've seen at least 3 today, these 2x2 matrices, right? Effort versus impact. You've got the good things in one corner, the bad things in another corner, right? Consultants love them. It's very easy to understand. This is not a 2x2 matrix. These are very, very intentionally drawn with curved lines to emphasize that this is not that strict categorization. These green areas here refer to liminal spaces. The inherent uncertainty, the inherent liminality between some of these. There are in-between spaces between complexity and complicated systems, and also with chaotic systems. We'll have a look at some of these a little bit later. If you're in a team with people, with human beings, you're in a complex system, a socio-technical system. But within that, you still have simple, clear problems. You're in a software team. Should you put your code in version control? Yes, you should. That is a pretty clear problem. Should you have a build pipeline? Yes, you should, almost certainly. But how do we design that build pipeline? That's a much more complicated problem. That's where our expertise comes in. That's where our experience as engineers is really useful, to see those good patterns, those good practices, figure out which we apply and which we don't, when we make exceptions to those good practices. Now, the question of how is our build pipeline going to affect other teams is a much more complex question. If our team builds a fantastic, reliable build and release pipeline, other teams might start relying on us. Maybe that might start sending more requests to us. Our software, our product might become much more critical to the business. That might change the future evolution of our team, the business. That's a much more complex and unpredictable system there. And of course, if production goes down, well, now we're in a little bit more of a chaotic state. You do whatever you can to get production back up so you can take the next step, right? You don't do a post-mortem until production is back. So this is important, right? Even when we're dealing with clear, simple problems or complicated engineering problems, we're usually part of a bigger, complex system. That's the nature of those open socio-technical systems. So I do think it's worth spending a little bit more time looking at these complex systems. And one important point about them is that they are dispositional, not deterministic. When we're talking about complex systems, we can't make deterministic predictive statements. If I do X, Y will happen. It might, but it might not. But that doesn't mean it's random. That doesn't mean that everything we do is random and completely meaningless. Some outcomes might be more likely than others. We might say that the system is disposed to certain outcomes and less disposed to other outcomes. One way of thinking about this is with fitness landscapes. Here is a very generic fitness landscape that I stole off Wikipedia. We've got 2 dimensions here, but they can be n-dimensional. We've got the sort of measuring scale here. So you can see here we've got these hills. These represent places that are hard to get to. It takes a lot of energy for the system to get up there. And then we've got these kind of maxima down here. It's easier for the system to get down there. We kind of roll downhill a little bit. Now imagine we're up here, this little kind of saddle here between two lower areas. If we put a bit of energy into the system there, it could end up down here, or it could end up in that other hole down there. At no point can we say, if I put this input in, we're going to end up in exactly this end state. But we can say that the system is disposed towards certain outcomes. It changes how we think about things. Another way of thinking about this is as attractors. Here's another lovely picture of an attractor, which I also stole from Wikipedia. Now, this is a really nice high-resolution projector. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a blue dot here, right? And if you follow this blue dot, it kind of enters the system, starts spiraling up, and it ends up there. And we got this other dot over here, and it kind of enters the system, it starts spiraling up, and it ends up over there. And all of these dots, no matter how they enter the system, end up in roughly the same space. This is an attractor. There is a gravitational pull in the system towards this point. I'm sure you all know about death march projects, right? All nodding your head. I see, this is the nod of head, this is the head nodding of people who've been on Death March projects. I know I have as well. So you've got tight deadlines, not enough budget, not enough people. You start missing deadlines, people start being yelled at, more deadlines come in, there's overtime, there's stress, people leave, threats to replace people, and all sorts of things. And we all know where that's leading. That's leading to disaster. That's a death march project or a death spiral project. That's an attractor in a system. It's a negative attractor that pulls in a very bad direction. But there are beneficial attractors as well. Really successful teams that do fantastic things, that do way better than anyone ever expected, that try new things, become legends, right? Other teams in the company talk about them. Did you hear about what that team did? What if we tried that? Those stories, those narratives become attractors, become enabling constraints in the system. They pull other teams towards them. And that's one of the key things that we can do in complex systems. We can manage energy to attractors. We search for those attractors. We take energy away from the negative ones, and we give more energy to the beneficial ones. Try and guide the evolution of the system through these ways. When we're working with complex systems, we're generally looking for patterns, not recipes. So I'm sure you've all followed a recipe at some point. Last weekend, I made a lovely stew for some friends, and I followed a recipe to do it. At one point in this recipe, it said you take the spice mix and you add it to the pan and you sizzle for 20 seconds. Then you proceed to the next step. That's a recipe. It's a sequence of steps. And you can make some pretty nice food with this. This isn't a bad thing. You can even have more complicated recipes. Some recipes have conditionals in them, right? Cook until browned. Cook until warm. Cook until sufficiently hot, right? Recipes can do fantastic things, but that's not generally how chefs are working. Really experienced chefs absolutely do follow recipes, absolutely do set timers, but they're doing different things. They're looking for patterns. Patterns in the smells and the sounds, the coloring of the food. They're seeing, hey, I've seen this before. I know the kind of thing this leads to. A pattern is a more open-ended thing than a sequence of steps. And a lot of what we think of as expertise is really just pattern matching. We're seeing experiences we've seen before, or similar things to experiences we've seen before, and we are trying to reproduce them. When you think about your job, would you rather work with people who are chefs or with people who follow recipes? Would you describe yourself as a chef or as someone who just follows a recipe? Something to think about, maybe. Now, you can use Cynefin as the sort of standard way, right? You look at Cynefin, you figure out, okay, what type of system are we in, and how do we act in this type of system? And that's really useful. That is kind of the whole point of Cynefin. But I think one of the more useful things, one of the really, really valuable things we can do with Cynefin is think about dynamics, not just how do we act when we're in a particular type of system, but how do we move between these different types of systems? So who here is in some sort of iterative development team, maybe a product team? You're, right, that's going up, right? Maybe you're doing Scrum, doing some sort of iterative development. You've probably experienced something like this. So if you're doing iterative development, I really hope, at some point you go out and talk to your users. Please tell me you go and talk to your users, okay? And that's a fairly complex thing to do, right? You're engaging with people. At the start of user research, at the start of that process, you don't know what your users want. Your users also don't know what they want. And what you want will change as soon as you give something to them. Nobody knew they wanted an iPhone until the iPhone existed. Engaging with real people is a very complex problem. We might get wonderful insights from that user research, but that's not really enough to build something. So at some point, we have to translate that down to something we can build. We write down stories and acceptance criteria and test cases and all of those things. And what we're doing here is we're going over into the complicated space. Here is where we apply our engineering expertise. Here's where we actually build things. And hopefully, again, once you've built something, you go back out to your users and you say, hey, does this work? Does this solve your problem? And you react to their responses. This is a fairly stable dynamic, because what we're doing here is we're balancing the need to engage with complexity, engage with our users, and the need to actually build things, structures that last and that we can build on. Sometimes, though, when we're building things, we try and standardize them. We take them down here. And this is a very, very dangerous thing to do. It's not something you should never do, but it is something you have to be very, very careful about. Who here has ever been on a standards body, maybe like a public standards body for a protocol or a... No? No one? Okay, so I think I have done some terrible things in a previous life, because I have been on a public standards body, and it was horrible. Lovely people, but it's incredibly difficult to do anything because because every single change needs to be thought through so carefully. Because once you encode something in rules, they become very, very difficult to change. They become the foundations we build on. If you build internal libraries or internal frameworks, they become the foundation on which other people build on. And it's hard to change. It ossifies that knowledge. That's not a bad thing. Those standards allow things to scale. Those structures give stability that allows us to build things on top of them. It's, again, not that any of these are good or bad, but we do need to understand the different dynamics. And there are other risks here as well, especially if we try and standardize things too early. So who here has ever learned a foreign language as an adult? Almost all of you, okay. Reading a French phrase book on the trip to France counts too, okay? So when you did that, I assume you looked at a book, right? And you saw inside that book lots and lots of rules. Here is how you conjugate verbs. Here is how you structure sentences. And those rules can be really, really helpful. Very, very important part of learning languages. But they will only get you so far. They will always miss things. You can read every single book about grammar and language structure, do every single language course in the world, but until you actually go out and talk to people, you are not going to know that language, because language is a dynamic, evolving system. The meaning of words and sentence structures changes over time. Unless we engage with that system, unless we engage with the socio-technical, the open system around us, we will not be able to capture that. If we try to overly constrain a complex system with rules and standards and structures, those rules will break. And they can break quite catastrophically. So in France, to the best of my knowledge, people drive on the right-hand side of the road, okay? That is a rule. It's a very, very fixed rule. It's a pretty clear rule, okay? If you decide to drive in France, you should not take an experimental approach, okay? You should not, let's see what happens, okay? No, you should just drive on the right-hand side of the road. But if someone jumps in front of your car, you should probably swerve. And there's a risk that when we encode things as rules, people focus so much on following and automating those rules that we fall into chaos. It's what this edge here, it's sometimes drawn as a cliff, represents. Rules are incredibly powerful. Rules and structure and order can be incredibly powerful things for building things and scaling things, but there are risks to them. We need to be very careful about how we build them. One more dynamic I want to look at very quickly is this one, this sort of flamingo pink here. Here we're skirting around complexity. If you've worked in an early stage startup or maybe some sort of discovery phase, you've been in here. If you're working in an early stage startup, you don't know what you're building. You don't have a business model yet. You're going out, you're talking to your users. You're embracing the fact that you don't have the answer, so you need to find an answer. Maybe over here, you dip into that complicated space. You build a proof of concept, a technical demo, just to see if something might work, test a hypothesis. Down here, we do what's known as a shallow dive into chaos. Has anyone here done a Crazy Eights design exercise? Okay, so slightly ableist name, but what you do is you get a bit of paper, you divide it into 8, and you're given a business problem to solve. And you are given typically about 80 seconds to write down 8 solutions for that problem. And what always happens is, you think the first few through, okay, this is going to be a nice little solution, that's one. This will be a nice little solution, that's number 2. And then you get about halfway through and you've realized you've used way over half of your time and you start going, I've got to write down anything that comes to your mind. You stop thinking about, is this practical, is this plausible, what's going to work? You actually remove those constraints that you usually apply. You are taking a shallow dive into chaos. Remember, chaos means a lack of constraint. And that can be a very powerful thing. This dynamic is not particularly stable. It's very high energy. But it's a very powerful thing for learning. It's very important. Oh, and this is a wonderful little diagram here, kind of capturing some of that. Chaotic, everything is on fire. Just put out the fire, okay? Complexity, we tend to sort of settle into complexity. Eventually, the fire will go out. And then we take the knowledge we learn from these experiments into this complicated domain. And like this ladder here, it takes real effort to find the things that can truly be standardized. And then finally get those things that can be automated. But there's always that risk of falling into chaos. Try and understand your own preferences. I like complex systems. I like complex problems. Okay, you can probably tell I'm giving a talk about complexity, right? Some people like complicated engineering problems. They want to sit down and write code and solve engineering problems all day. Also fine. I have a friend who does free climbing. She climbs mountains without a harness, right? She's removing constraints. She likes chaotic situations. She doesn't do that all the time. Again, very high energy. But understand your preferences, because the key phrase here about Cynefin is bounded applicability. A given approach is not objectively good or bad, it is good or bad in a particular context. A leader that does very well in a chaotic system, imposing order and structuring things so we can move forward, is going to do terribly in a clear situation. It's just going to stress everyone out. And what I do, whenever I find myself reading guidance or rules or advice, or even giving guidance and advice, I try and ask myself, what sort of system is this meant for? So, I work in Germany, and just for a little bit of context, for those of you who don't know, most of Germany's economy is sort of making small precision machinery that makes smaller, more precision machinery. And as a result of some work I did with one of my clients, I was looking at industrial automation solutions, and I found this guide here about how to install a fanless computer, right? And they said if you download our fanless computer guide, you'll learn all the do's and don'ts to ensure your project is a success. I opened up this guide. I saw lots of do this, don't do that, you should probably do this, you should probably not do that. And I thought to myself, what sort of guidance is this? It's rules, it's structure, it's good practice, it's best practice. This is for clear and complicated systems. And you know what? Industrial automation, installing a fanless computer, probably is that kind of system. This is probably fine. But the flip side of this is I sometimes intentionally inflict psychic damage on myself by looking up agile maturity assessments online. So I found this one. It asks you to rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 4 in these various agile areas. So we've got 3 for applying agile and 2 for cross-functional. And then it asks you to write down what's your target level. Kind of helpfully tells you what's the gap between your current level and your target level. Some of the more advanced ones will even auto-populate a little collection of actions for you to complete to get to your target level. What is this in terms of Cynefin? Clear, right? It is literally, look at the world, categorize yourself on a scale of 0 to 4, and then apply the appropriate rules. Sense, categorize, respond. It's applying clear sets of rules to team building. Who here really thinks that building and evolving a team is a clear, simple, predictable problem with obvious rules? Don't see any hands going? Okay, maybe. Our favorite agile framework does this as well. SAFe is a proven approach. It works no matter what your size, industry, or complexity. It never says best practice, but that is what it's saying between the lines, yeah? Follow our approach and you will succeed. We are the experts, follow our rules. And see, here's the thing. To an organization that is trying to change, that's trying to grow, complexity is scary, okay? There's unpredictability. Nobody can tell you exactly where you're going to end up. No one can tell you exactly how you're going to get there. Here be dragons. And when someone comes along and says, no, don't worry about that. This isn't a complex problem. We're the experts. We have the expertise to help you here. In fact, we are such good experts that we can reduce this down to a nice set of rules. Just follow our steps and you will succeed. This is a very compelling sales pitch. Wherever you are, it makes sense to convince people. It is financially beneficial to convince people that you're in a complicated domain. Complicated is the realm of experts, consultants, and snake oil salesman. Speaking as a consultant, they're not always the same, but they sometimes are. There's an engineering term known as AM/FM. It refers to the distinction between actual machines and fucking magic. Now, to borrow an example from Well, There's Your Problem, if I want to get across Paris later today, I am going to take the metro. I'm going to take some public transport. And it might be a little bit late. It might be delayed or stopped by engineering works. It might be a bit dirty, but it's probably going to get me there, right? It's going to be a bit clunky, but it's an actual machine. But people get frustrated with that, so they say, well, what if we had flying cars? What if we had tubes that take you to your end destination? Teleporters, even. Sounds lovely, but that's fucking magic. And the idea that we can reduce transforming organizations, teams of any size, to a simple set of rules, that's fucking magic. And worse than that, it's colonialist shit. It's colonialist. Storming in with our best practices. Here is the set of rules that you need to follow to succeed. We have the answer. You were just too stupid to understand it. We understand your context better than you do. That's a colonialist mindset. So how do we apply our engineering expertise? Because we do have engineering expertise. How do we apply that without taking this approach? I want to talk about a particular approach that we take at ThoughtWorks, where I work. We're a global technology consultancy. And I'm not suggesting that you copy exactly this, because the solution that we came up with came from our particular context, our particular history. And it comes from one very specific challenge that we have, which is that ThoughtWorkers write lots of books. Just if you leave someone from ThoughtWorks alone in a room for long enough, they will write a book, possibly several. There is at least one ex-ThoughtWorker in this conference today who has written a book. This sounds lovely, but it's actually got there's some problems with this as well, which is that how do you onboard people? Do you say, hey, welcome to ThoughtWorks, please read these 100 books, and then you can start? That's not practical. And how do we actually use this expertise without reducing it to a set of rules, a set of best practices that are context-free? The approach we've taken is what we call sensible default practices. They're a set of practices. Things like trunk-based development, test-driven development, pair development, fast automated build, and so on and so forth. Concrete practices that any team can do. We link those to the 4 key metrics, measures of success, show here's why we're doing this. And we also pair this up with some values, things that we care about, things that we want to achieve. Fast feedback, repeatability, simplicity. And this allows us, so any team can look at this and they can say, okay, well, trunk-based development. I understand why we do that, right? We do that to increase deployment frequency, decrease mean time to recovery, and to get fast feedback, right? I get why we do this. But more important than just the practices and the values that we have there, we also pair it with some advice. We have an internal web page where we say that our sensible default practices are not set in stone. They are not a recipe that every project team must adhere to. They often require discipline, experience, the use of complementary practices. They require chefs, not just people who follow recipes. We must continuously learn, improve, adapt, abandon, and add to our sensible default practices. It's a reminder that every single time we apply these, they need to be applied in the context that we're working. We need to understand the context of the people we're working with. It's not a checklist we all have to follow. Every time we apply them, it's an opportunity to learn. It's an experiment. In Cynefin terms, they allow us to get into this pattern really, really quickly because we have the practices, the concrete things that the teams can do, and we have the values that help us understand how to experiment with them. I make this change, I know how to judge the effectiveness of that experiment. And they don't always work. Sometimes we have to make exceptions and tweaks. Sometimes we learn from those failures and we share those back with a wider community. They don't always work because they're actual machines, not fucking magic. Thanks. I think we might be out of time for questions. Are we? I assume I'm out of time for questions. No, okay, well, that's lovely. Anyway, there's loads of references for this talk I put them on GitHub. You can just find the link there, or just I'll tweet them or something. Loads of links here. I'm not going to go through all of them. I really recommend following Dave Snowden on Twitter. So he really likes hiking. So his Twitter feed is about 1/3 pictures of the country, 1/3 him sharing really insightful Cynefin and complexity stuff, and 1/3 him getting extremely angry at people peddling bullshit, which I think is a really good balance for a Twitter account, personally. Couple of books. This red book here is a collection of essays on Cynefin, highly recommended, lots of different perspectives and context and experiences there. Complexity and Postmodernism by Paul Cilliers is the kind of go-to book I would recommend for really digging deep into complex adaptive systems theory if you really want to understand what we mean by complexity. Fooled by Randomness explores this idea of retrospective coherence when we look in complex systems. Cause and effect only makes sense in reverse when we look back on it, not necessarily predictive for the future. And Sources of Power looks at how we build expertise when working with complex systems. There's a couple of videos here. Again, this is all on the link that I did, but this is a very short video by Dave. He explains Cynefin in terms of planning a children's birthday party. It's like 4 minutes long, very short, very funny, really insightful. And this one is about rewilding Agile. Very influential for me, highly recommend it. You can find a link to all of those things just there. Thank you again very much. Questions? If not, sorry, there was a hand. Please, go for it.
So you got me thinking. Is people following a recipe? Is a novice following a recipe applying the simple, clear rules to it when it actually should be either complicated or complex? Because the food is obviously complex.
Yeah.
And you're going to easily fall into chaos by simply applying the rules of the recipe.
Yeah, very quickly. So there's this, Is food complex? It's a wonderful question. There's a great quote from a friend of Paul Cilliers, which is that a jumbo jet is complicated, mayonnaise is complex. That quote was from a French person, just to clarify, right? Because yes, there are there's microbiotics in there. There are systems. There's non-reproducibility. All of the lovely complexity stuff. So yes, there's actually absolutely elements of complex systems. If you step backwards far enough, if you frame the question or the particular problem of food correctly, you can start to give some more clear questions, or more clear answers, like say, I have some raw chicken. If I cook this in an oven at 200 degrees for 8 hours, I'm definitely not going to get salmonella from that, okay? There's going to be other problems with that, okay? So you can reduce it to some clearer question, depends on the kind of granularity of what you're doing. If, again, you really want to do some amazing, interesting, complex things with that food, then yes, it does start to get a lot more complex, and it's a lot more looking for those patterns and less following recipes. I think a lot about exceptions, okay? So with a complicated system, we expect exceptions even to good practices. Yeah. Like, yep, this is a good practice, but sometimes you break the rules. Cooking is actually a good example of that. Generally good practices, but sometimes you break. So there's a mix, and that's why there's that liminal space there with complexity.
Thank you.
Cool, all right. Good question. Any other questions? If not, I'll say thank you very much.